Hi, I'm Marius from Mental Model Space, and this is part 1 of Introduction to Systems Theory. In this video, I'll be talking about the motivation behind systems theory and sort of philosophizing in general about problem-solving approaches. This is going to be sort of more abstract, so I hope I don't lose you along the way. I'll start out by talking about the failures of traditional problem-solving approaches, and then move on to describe how systems theory can help out with these failures. Then towards the end, I'll give an outline of how the rest of the series will look like, where we'll be discussing systems theory in detail, and I'll conclude with a list of books and online resources on the topic. So when we're confronted with complex problems, we've learned basically this one approach to try to solve them, which is reductionism, where we take the complex problem, divide it into parts, look at the parts separately, and then try to put it back together. And so most of science is built on this, and it works well in certain contexts, especially if the problem is modular. So for example, in computer science or math, but it fails miserably in other contexts where you have a lot of components that have a lot of interactions with each other, such in the case of economies or societies or like global climate, and also biology. And to give an example from biology, in drug development, like over 90% of all advanced candidates fail for one reason or another. And with such a poor success rate, one has to ask if the sort of approach one is using to try to solve these problems is correct. To illustrate how reductionism works in practice, I'd like to use the example of a watch. So imagine you're handed a Rolex and you're asked to show how this thing can tell time. So the Rolex would be the complex problem. We could then divide the problem, so take out all of the parts in the Rolex, and then analyze those parts. For example, we might see that there's like a spring that acts as a power reserve. I might see that there's like an escapement mechanism which keeps the time, and all of that is then transferred via a series of gears to the watch face. Once we have this knowledge and know the function of each of the parts, we can then reassemble the watch and show how it can tell time as a whole. However, this approach makes certain assumptions that may lead to problems. First, there's the question in the first step, where do we cut? So when we're dividing the problem, we need to know what we're taking apart, right? And in the case of the watch, it's pretty simple because we've got isolated physical components. So we probably wouldn't cut a gear in half, for example, right? We just take the stuff apart. But in the case where the components aren't physical and we're not quite sure what the connections are between them, for example, in the case of like an economy, we might not know where to cut. And if we sever important connections, this will screw up our analysis later down the line. Then there's the question of context. So if we have a single gear in front of us, it might be hard to tell what it does because like for its function to become apparent, we might have to see it in the context of the watch. And we could solve this problem in the case of the Rolex by making like a diagram when we're disassembling the watch. And then when we have like this gear, we could see where it came from and look at it like its local context and maybe figure out its function that way. Also along the lines of context is the question of if two parts are actually the same. So if we have two physically identical gears, we might assume if we're looking at them in isolation that they're the same. But maybe in the context of the watch, they do wildly different things. And then there's the question of, can we put it back together? So can we reassemble the watch after we've done it? If we like made a diagram, maybe we can. If we didn't, it might be a little more difficult. But still in the case of the watch, because it's like all physical parts, if it fits inside like the case, we know at least that we've succeeded. And then there's a question of what if the whole is unknown? So in the case of the watch, we were like handed this thing as a whole and we kind of know what it does, it tells time. But sometimes we only know the parts and we sort of start out of this in like a later step of this process. For example, in the case again of economies, like we know the individual actors much better than we know how the system as a whole behaves. And so this is also not amenable to this reductionist approach. So we might think that a watch is pretty complicated, like it's like a marvel of human engineering, right? But the natural systems that we're interested in are literally millions of times more complicated than an automatic Rolex. So a Rolex has like 115 parts, and maybe every component interacts physically with like two or three other components, right? But if we look at economies, there we have billions of actors, each interacting with dozens of other actors. At least in the case of economies, all of the actors are human, so we can kind of assume that on average they'll behave similarly, so we've kind of got like one component type. But if we move to biological systems, there we have, in a single cell, we have tens of billions of proteins, which again interact with like up to dozens of other proteins. But here, we don't just have one component type, we have over 10,000 different types with wildly different functions and different types of interacting with each other. So this complicates the situation massively. Despite the complexity of the systems we just saw, we still intuitively assume linear event-based causality. So in the news, for example, we often hear, oh yeah, the war in wherever leads to an increase in prices somewhere else, which leads to further consequences, etc. Right? And if we schematically analyze this, we see that we have like this tree structure where event A leads to event B, leads to event D. Event A may also lead to event C, and so on. But again, this intuitive idea of how things are connected makes certain assumptions that aren't always justified. First off, it assumes that events are distinct from each other and that they're time-bound, so that they happen like at a specific time and often a specific place. It also assumes that each event has a principal cause. And even if we go so far as to think of multiple causes, we usually limit that to about 3. And then of those 3, we kind of say, oh yeah, one of those is like the main cause, right? And finally, this also implicitly assumes that events that lie beyond our time horizon or our memory are irrelevant to what's happening at the moment. So like in the case of news coverage, for example, the time horizon is like weeks. So news coverage seldomly goes further back than a couple weeks to explain what's happening now. Even if we're doing detailed analyses, we probably don't go back further than 5 years often to describe what's happening now and what's causing the current situation. And again, these assumptions, they can create problems. So we have to ask ourselves, for example, in regard to the events being distinct and time-bound, is when we're noticing an event really when it's happening or when it happened? So it could be, right, that B was happening for a very long time and then it just got a bit worse and then we noticed it. And now we think, oh yeah, B just happened, right? But if it's been happening for a long time, it might have had other effects that we are not aware of now because we kind of assume this like one point in time where B happens. Then also we have the tendency that once events are sort of a couple degrees separated from each other, like in this diagram it would be if they're on separate branches of the tree, that they no longer interact with each other. But there's no reason to assume why F, for example, couldn't be interacting with B and like have caused B or whatever. And then finally, there's the question of, what if D leads to A again? And we sort of have this loop structure where A leads to B, leads to D, leads to A, etc. But because our time horizon is limited and it's too short, we don't recognize this overarching pattern, which may help us sort of gain insight into how this system is behaving. So we're constrained by these two problems, namely the reductionist approach to problem solving and sort of this linear event-based thinking, that are both very intuitive to us, but run into serious problems when confronted with large systems with many interactions. So the latter problem we can solve by moving from thinking about events to thinking about processes. So if we have sort of these events, A, B, C, and A again, we can try to unravel the underlying structure by modeling. So we could, for example, generate a model where we say that event A always leads to event B, always leads to event C, which then leads back to A again. Once we have a model, we can also simulate this stream of events and possibly predict the future. The question remains open of how we want to validate the model. There's no way to 100% guarantee that your model is correct. In general, you can only invalidate models. For example, this ABC pattern might go on for a long time, but then the pattern could be broken, which may mean that our model is no longer sufficient to explain the data. In regards to our reductionism conundrum, we can try to combat that problem by modeling increasingly large portions of our system. Ideally, we'd like to model the entire system, but this might not always be possible because there's a trade-off between the system size we can model and the model complexity. So the first reason for this is computational. So if we have increasingly complicated interactions between the individual components of our model, like this might scale unfavorably if we increase the number of components. So in the worst case, it would be like exponential. The second reason is that we might not have enough data to actually generate a model from, especially if we're dealing with a model that has like many complex interactions and also has a lot of components. And sort of here in this trade-off between system size and model complexity is where systems theory comes in and where it strikes a really nice balance. So systems theory allows us to like model fairly large systems with decent complexity. And also systems theory strikes a nice balance between like using computation to simulate things and also still remaining really intuitively understandable and giving us like lessons that we can learn without having to use like mathematical formulas and computers to simulate things. The components we will be using to build models in system theory are stocks, flows, feedbacks, and delays. So a stock might be like a lake. We might have another stock, which is a reservoir, and we might have a flow of water between those. There may also be like a feedback loop, which controls the inflow into the reservoir based on the water level in that reservoir. Stocks and flows don't necessarily have to be physical. They could also be intangible. And this means that sort of systems theory is applicable wherever we can model using stocks and flows. Because these can be physical or non-physical, this allows systems theory to cover a really like broad range of real-world situations. So my goal for this series is to give a really intuitive and down-to-earth description of systems theory. And sort of next time, once we start discussing systems theory for real, things will get a lot more concrete. I'm going to start out with discussing system structure, and there we'll see what real-world elements we can sort of model using stocks and flows and such. And we'll also see that we can sort of intuitively visualize large systems fairly easily. In the second part, we'll see how systems behave over time. Also, we'll see that delays cause systems to behave really unpredictably. But luckily, in the third part, we'll see that certain behaviors tend to pop up over and over again. And in systems theory, these are referred to as archetypes. And archetypes are really cool because if we can sort of identify their characteristic behaviors out in the wild, in the real world, then we can also apply their characteristic solutions to them. And that can solve real-world problems. And finally, I'll introduce the concept of leverage when we're trying to intervene in systems and change systems behavior. And there we'll see that sort of the places where we would usually intuitively intervene into the systems are usually exactly the wrong places. And so the place where we have the least amount of leverage. So for example, if we're considering like a corrupt government or something like that, replacing the corrupt leader is not necessarily the best place to intervene in that system. There might be better approaches to get the desired outcome. In terms of additional resources, I will be basing this series roughly on Thinking in Systems by Donnell H. Meadows. If you're looking for a first book in systems theory, I can really recommend that one. It's got like no maths in it, and it's only 260 pages long, and it gives really a good intuitive like description of what systems theory is. If you're more interested into like business applications of systems theory, The Fifth Discipline by Peter Senge is sort of the standard book there. I won't be touching on business stuff that much in this series. And if you don't want to buy a book, there's tons of good free online resources on systems theory, and most of them are linked to in SystemsWiki.org, which is Gene Bellinger's site. He also authored an interactive book, which you can get for free there, called Beyond Connecting the Dots. And that's kind of cool because it's got like sort of integrated models in there, which are made with Insight Maker, which is also a tool that I think he authored, which lets you simulate like systems theory models online in your browser. You can find these slides, as well as written posts on systems theory and other topics, on my website at mentalmodel.space. With that, thanks for your attention, and I hope to see you next time for System Structure.